What's going on, everybody? So today I'll be going over if HoYoverse should buff older characters in the near future or if they should keep it at the current 4 right now. So let's go over things. Right, first things first, I have to say the way they handled these buffs, in my opinion, could not have been more perfect, right? Because what they have done essentially with these units is they have given them a better chance in the meta, but at the same time they haven't made the DPS so much better to the point where the newer units are now obsolete. Because I made a couple of videos right going over that, I was kind of worried that Honkai Sorrow was going to start going with the Genshin approach, because I personally am a fan of how the power creep has been going. I've made numerous videos going over how people exaggerate the power creep, but essentially I like the idea of having to constantly keep up with the meta in a game that's already easy like Honkai Sorrow, right? Considering some of the other more casual games that HoYoverse made, I was worried that their hardest game was going to start going more casual, and I'm speaking as a free-to-play. But instead, like I said, these buffs are noticeable, right? But they haven't really made that big of a dent in the meta, right? Overall, I personally don't really look at Prideman at all, but if we want to look at Prideman, right, Jingliu and the other 3 units here have probably risen up by about half, if not a full tier in the tier lists, right, which is great. I think honestly, if they're going to buff units incrementally like that, a slight buff that'll give them a big advantage, but not so much to the point where they're overpowered, I think that'll be really, really good, right? I personally would not want to see, considering the fact that we're in version 3.4, I would not want to see a unit, a DPS. Me personally, right, I just would not want to see a DPS that's 2 years old, a really aged DPS, out DPSing more modern day DPSs, right? I personally wouldn't want to see that. I'm sure a lot of other people wouldn't want to see that. I might be going against the echo chamber here, but I just don't like the idea of holding on to a unit and using them as a crutch to brute force all of the end game in the long term, right? I think a DPS should stay up in the #1 spot for maybe half a year, right? Kind of like the Herda. The Herda, in my opinion, was the best DPS up until 3.4. Now we have Archer, who arguably could be better, right? He definitely has on par damage multipliers. Will he be better than Herda long term? I'm not too sure. Phanon is definitely a no-brainer, right? Phanon's just not real. But I really like how they handled the buffed units in 3.4, and I feel like if they're going to buff units like that, they could do it. #1, they could do it on a yearly basis. Maybe we could have somewhere between 2 to 4 older units getting buffed per year. That way they're not completely obsolete, but they're not really that great either. Because when we look at Jingliu is definitely a lot better, but you're not going to be using her in MOC, right? If you don't have Hyacinth, you're not going to be using her. Even if you do have Hyacinth, if you don't have that great of a Jingliu team comp or build, you're not going to be using her really in MOC. And even so, she's not going to out DPS an E0 S0 Phanon at all, unless her and her full team's E6 S5, and you have like 40 plus crit value relics on every single thing on her, right? Which is almost, next to nobody. So there's really not much else to say. I absolutely loved how they handled these buffs. I will say though, I have been playing a little bit of Zenless Zone Zero lately, and they also have been buffing older units in that game. But the thing is, with Ellen Jo from that game, right, they kind of switched up her animations a little bit and how her attack patterns function. I do kind of wish they did the same with the units in this game, right? At the very least with Jingliu, because other than damage multipliers, the only big difference is the fact that she gets extra crit damage. She's also HP scaling, and really she gets 1 extra stack, right? So she has a lot less downtime, which is absolutely huge, right? I made videos going over how older DPSs fell off because of their downtime, right? Jingliu had so much downtime. Firefly has, even now, because she hasn't gotten buffed, she has so much downtime, which is so unbelievably bad in this day and age. You need a DPS who will always be doing damage even when they're not in their enhanced state, right? Phanon can do decent damage output when he's not in his full form. Herda, when she doesn't have her big AoE hit or her ult, can still do decent hits, right? And if you have someone like Sparkle or someone else who can action events, it'll be even better. But when you have a unit that heavily relies on an enhanced state to do their damage, right, and they have a lot of downtime, it can lead to, you know, discrepancies in how well they actually function, right? Like I said, Firefly and Jinglu are the prime example. So that's about it for this video. I don't think this should be a Genshin situation at all, in the sense that every single unit is viable. We should not be seeing E0, S0, Yanqing clears, or main DPS Herda, mini Herda clears, right? I personally would not want to see something like that. I think the balance, right? This game is not well balanced at all, but I like it, right? I like the idea of keeping up with units. And I really was worried about these buffs. I thought the buffs were going to completely skewer this game's meta and just make it mind-numbingly easy for anybody who has a single functioning brain cell. But the game's meta is relatively untouched, right? You have a better chance of using Jinglu. You have a better chance of using Skibidi Wolf in a lot of your team comps. But they're not going to be destroying the endgame. They're just better, right? They're simply just better. But that's about it for this video. Tribu's still better for Silver Wolf with an Archer team comp, so that should go, right? That should put into perspective just how balanced the buffs are, right? But that's about it. I'll see y'all. Goodbye.